So, you want to get into Metroid? Metroid as a franchise is very near and dear to my heart. If you don't believe me, just look at this vain display of merchandise from the series that I keep in my dungeon. However, aside from a select few times that I've made my thoughts heard and opinions clear on the subject, I haven't really made any videos about Metroid specifically, why I like it or why you should too. And that's exactly what I'm going to rectify today. You want to play Metroid 4 but don't know where to start? Are you interested in the franchise in general and want to know which games are worth playing? Do you even know what a Metroidvania is? There's no shame in not knowing, most Metroidvania fans don't either. Oh, wait. Better. Good morning, everyone everywhere. If you're curious, I can't really properly snap my fingers, so that sound had to be added in post. I can, however, snap the joint in my left thumb, but out of courtesy, I won't demonstrate this stunning ability now. Okay, yeah, you've probably noticed it by now, there's no getting around it at this point. When I took a shower and shaved my mustache for the skit, I also tried popping the pimple on my forehead, and now it looks like this. Just try not to think about it, you'll start to ignore it soon enough. First things first, I think we should recognize that even if I personally think that Metroid is a great franchise in many ways, it very possibly might not be for you. This is something that depressingly many people miss when recommending a series. They assume their personal enjoyment is reflected in everyone else if they just try hard enough. It doesn't work like that. Preferences in gaming, or all forms of media in general, isn't like learning a language or riding a bike. You can't just do it by believing in it. That's why, before we delve into what Metroid is, I think we should highlight what it isn't. For example, many people see Metroid Prime surface level aesthetics and expect a constantly gritty and mature shooter with non-stop action. It can be that at times, but it's important to remember that Metroid is still, at its core, a franchise about methodical exploration, a captivating atmosphere, and flying killer jellyfish with fangs. You shouldn't take the games too seriously either. They're not military dramas. You control a lady in a mech suit composed of life energy, with her body coursing with so many different strands of DNA and mutations that she can barely even be called human at this point. As with most games in this genre, Metroid makes you collect items to progress in a constantly evolving puzzle box of world design, which can be very engaging for some, yet not that for others who would rather want to constantly move forward a predetermined path. In short, Metroid is for players that enjoy going through fascinating environments and gradually powering up into a ridiculous being of pure destruction, while piecing together fascinating but usually optional lore. What's great about Metroid is that you have a great deal of control of how you want to play. You can take your time and put up with many quiet, borderline introspective moments, as you open up incredibly designed worlds little by little, finally blasting through it all in such a blaze of glory that you can't help but play again. Alternatively, you can take most of the games as a speedrun challenge from the beginning, and treat it almost like an arcade shoot-em-up. That open-ended structure of play is understandably not for every... Oh, you're interested? Then why didn't you say so? We'd have saved a whole lot of time! Next, a little bit of background. Metroid is an absolute classic game franchise, which started with the first game in 1986, or 1987 for us Westerners. It has come to span about 13 games of varied critical acclaim, or 14 if you also include games with... not that. Even if you've never played a single game from the franchise, you've surely heard the name, or at least played as or against the annoying robot lady in Super Smash Bros. Another context that you might know the word Metroid from is from the portmanteau Metroidvania. If you're already aware of what this term refers to, feel free to skip to the next chapter. Metroidvania refers to a subgenre of action-adventure games with non-linear and environmentally guided gameplay that usually consists of lock and key-like progression, i.e. you have to get a key, like a new movement upgrade for example, so you can access another part of the world that you often have to backtrack to. Backtracking is the act of traveling back partially or fully within your explored area to bypass some kind of obstacle in front of a path that was unavailable to you earlier. Now, I know I've just thrown a lot of words at you, but here's the gist of it. Generally speaking, there's two kinds of Metroidvania, linear ones and non-linear ones. If you'd please consult the graph. A linear Metroidvania mostly consists of locks and keys that are right next to each other in progression. A non-linear one often forces you to backtrack to earlier areas instead. This backtracking can sometimes be aided with shortcuts to previous areas, but there's generally still some exploration of previous areas that you have to go through. Because of this, non-linear Metroidvanias... Metroidvania? Metroidvania? Oh, it's Metroidvanias. Are often interwovenly labyrinthine in nature, while linear games maps often look like they're made out of straight lines with more guided and scripted progression. This is why Metroidvanias with more involved and active stories tend to prefer this much more linear form of level and upgrade progression. Now to answer the question or questions at the top of this video, where should I start? What games do I play? Well, it depends. It really depends on a lot of things. Do you want to go through a gripping story? Do you prefer excitement and action, or lore and exploration? What mood you're in? No, really, really. Some Metroid games are significantly harder than others, either throughout the game or only in part. Others are scarier and feel much more isolating, while still others can have a much more heroic and bombastic vibe to them. None of these are the correct choice, mind you, there is only a correct choice for you. With those pseudo-intellectual semantics out of the way, I can advise you on 3 different orders of playing through the games. A chronological order, a beginner-friendly order, and a secret 13. The secret 13 is just my own custom order, just so you know. Okay, so... this is a timeline of the Metroid franchise that I made a while ago myself. It's actually attached to a larger discussion about how Metroid Other M is not canon, but that doesn't have much weight on what we're talking about today and can be ignored, just like the game itself. Whatever the case, this timeline can also be used here to illustrate, without any major spoilers, how you should go about when playing the Metroid games in chronological order, i.e. to enjoy the story. Let's start from the beginning. No. Not that beginning. Yeah, right there. If you're really serious about wanting to know everything about Metroid, its protagonist Samus Aran, and other long-standing characters in the franchise, I recommend starting here. But if you're strictly going to play through the games, they're absolutely not necessary, and the game's canon takes priority. I cannot emphasize that enough. For example, Metroid Dread tweaks Samus' backstory a little bit, which supersedes whatever the Metroid manga has taught us about her, although a majority of its story is still relevant and canon. So, let's move on. I really like the Metroid manga, personally, and I greatly recommend it if you ever become like a bigger fan of Metroid, but it's not really necessary, especially like for the future of Metroid. So yeah, without any spoilers, Metroid Zero Mission is the first game in the series chronology-wise. As you may have already known, this game is a remake, and as with most franchises, Metroid remakes take priority in canon over the originals. This means that the original versions of both Metroid 1 and 2 from 1986 and 1991 respectively aren't canon because Zero Mission and recently Samus Returns exist. But to get back on the topic, I'd say Zero Mission is a great way to get into Metroid. Zero Mission is about as prototypical of a non-linear Metroidvania experience that you're going to find. It's not perfect, but it's engaging, easy to get through and just long enough to keep your interest, but not too long and expansive that you lose your interest. Looking at you, Hollow Knight. Not only is it beginner friendly, it's also easily playable on the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pack. And on some aftermarket channels which, let's be honest, you're probably more likely to play through. Don't worry, I won't judge, just look at my letterboxd. Yeah. Next, we arrive at a crossroads. All the Metroid Prime games that have released by now have occurred chronologically in between Metroid 1 and Metroid 2. However, not only do I think that starting them right after the first 2D Metroid isn't the best timing, they are also not part of the main story that the 2D games strive to tell, so we'll ignore them for now. Rest easy, my dear. Your time will come. I'm sure of it. The next 3 games are pretty straightforward. Metroid 2, Super Metroid and Fusion all follow one contiguous story, but once again, Samus Returns replaces the Game Boy original. I'd say all 4 of these games so far are worth playing through. But if you're stretched for time, Metroid 2 is recapped at the start of Super Metroid and isn't a very story-heavy game to begin with. Fusion, on the other hand, is. If you want to play Metroid Dread and want the absolute minimum of background knowledge about why Samus is where she is at the beginning of Dread, I would recommend playing Fusion. Without spoiling too much, Dread ties all of the previous 2D Metroid games together and crafts an open-ended finale for the saga, potentially starting a new story for Samus. She doesn't die at the end, imagine that. But wait a minute, you may have noticed I skipped a certain game in that timeline. What about this Other M thing?
You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so.
All I could do was question his authority and make things more difficult.
Okay. I'll probably have to make an entire separate video about that game. For now, all you have to know is that the game isn't very good, which is great, because that means you won't have to suffer through it. Not at all. I cannot emphasize enough how much this goddamn game is not worth playing. Like at all. If you do insist on knowing why, and can't wait for a separate video on the topic, please check the description for my thesis on Metroid Other M's canonicity. It brings up a lot of the same problems that also have to do with its general issues. Finally, we arrive at Metroid Prime. But Franco, how does Metroid Prime tie into everything? Prime 4 is coming soon, maybe even this year, so what am I supposed to play to understand a game? Well, calm down, imaginary commenter. Who am I kidding? I have 20 subscribers, probably none of whom are big enough Metroid fans, even potential ones to ask that, well... Scratch that. Anyway, But your question is a good one, imaginary commenter. The Metroid Prime games absolutely have their place in the franchise and the story, but they're also in a peculiar spot in regards to the future of the series and Metroid Prime 4 beyond specifically. First, the games have their own bunch of antagonists that have little to do with anything that happens in the mainline 2D games. Are they worthwhile additions to the overall story and generally enjoyable games to play through in their own right? Absolutely, but they're not essential, you know? Second, technically, you should play these games to know what's happening in Prime 4. But I strongly suspect Beyond will do a good enough job that won't be necessary. In fact, it seems like Prime 4 is starting a completely different plotline from the previous mainline Prime games, since that story was resolved in Prime 3. Of course, if you want to get a feel for the type of gameplay we can probably expect from Prime 4, you should probably play Prime Remastered on Switch, or if possible, play this, the Metroid Prime trilogy, and have a grand old time with them. Just as a side note, Metroid Prime Trilogy is my absolute favorite series of games of all time, and I promise you that it's worth all the praise I can give it, or could give it. However, my individual favorite game of all time isn't actually any Metroid Prime game. In fact, while it is a Metroid game, it's not one that has come up yet, and that's because we'll have to go beyond... See what I did? We'll have to go beyond official releases to arrive at the true answer to our question of what Metroid game you should start with, or what you should play first, or to get into the franchise in general. But first, a word from our sponsor. Just kidding, I don't have any yet. I do, however, have a second channel where I'll upload more casual and simple content like breakdowns and discussion videos. I actually uploaded a more casual discussion video on everything we know about Metroid Prime 4 at the same time as this video went live, so feel free to check it out after finishing this video. Personally, I think Metroid is a very beginner-friendly series. Most of the game's stories happen so much in the background of the actual gameplay that there isn't really as much of an incentive to experience it firsthand, unlike in something like The Last of Us or Metal Gear Solid or... Kirby. This might come as a surprise from someone like me, who you'd assume to want to shill you into playing through the entirety of the franchise yourself and gatekeeping the latest entries until you've experienced the full story. And while I do want to do that, I also recognize that isn't exactly appealing or easy to do for everyone. Even I haven't played every Metroid game, so what's the any percent, if you will? The easiest approach to Metroid games that you could possibly have. Honestly, you can just start with Zero Mission. But you could also start with Metroid Dread, or Prime Remastered. The latest release is on Switch. Yes, Dread's the latest game in the story, I'm keenly aware of that, but let's be honest, if you think you don't have interest in playing through them all, you probably won't play a single one, because you won't take that first step. Losing a little bit of the excitement you'd get from Dread's story if you had the full context is a small price to pay, in my opinion, if it means having an entry point to the franchise at all. And Dread is great for that purpose. An entry point. It's very accessible with its great map and fast travel system, it's exciting but also atmospheric when it needs to be, and even if you think it's too difficult, you always have the option of playing it on a lower difficulty. Mercury's team really did their best to make Dread a viable experience as one's first Metroid game. But, as you may remember, I said that my favorite game of all time is a Metroid game that I haven't brought up yet, although it has still been present throughout this video. More specifically, its soundtrack has. A soundtrack to a game so good, even Nintendo couldn't have made it. And a remake so good, it had to be taken down by Nintendo to avoid competition of their own updated version of Metroid 2. A singular fan game, so unbelievably amazing to 12-year-old me, that it single-handedly kickstarted my approach towards gaming and has led us to this very moment. I am of course talking about AM2R. Yes, believe it or not, I think that a fan-made PC remake from 2016 of a Game Boy sequel from 1991 is the optimal way to get into Metroid, and for multiple reasons. Despite the unpaid advertising I just did for the game, my DMs are open, Team Fusion, I genuinely believe AM2R, or another Metroid 2 remake, is the absolute best way to get into Metroid. I'd argue that I would believe it even if I wouldn't have all of the nostalgia and bias to do with it being my first experience with the franchise. Let me elaborate. First, let's backtrack. Why do people want to play Metroid? I mean, aside from being excited for a new entry like Prime 4, or randomly getting recommended these games because of their massive prestige, what are the specific reasons you should play these games instead of some other Metroidvania, or any other games for that matter? What makes Metroid tick? What about this game franchise specifically deserves your attention? Well, I'd say it's the exploration, the atmosphere, and the environment. The isolation, the often constant background hum of someone or something being just around the corner to catch you. At points, these titles can even border on sci-fi horror. Well, AM2R has that. It's about Samus being sent to kill dozens of Metroids on their home planet so that they'd get finally and ultimately eradicated. Yeah, you're the only human being on the planet of SR-388, and no one other than Samus is qualified to carry out this mission. These desolate environments are highlighted by incredible pixel artistry and this absolute banger of a soundtrack. Seriously, if my words haven't been adequate enough to convince you, please listen to this music for just a minute or two and tell me you aren't hooked. Next, is AM2R accessible? How can I play it and how difficult will it be if I decide to do so? Well, that's another excellent question, unnamed YouTube commenter. As I mentioned at the top of this chapter, AM2R is a PC game, and not only that, but it also has ports for Linux and Mac. This footage was captured on a Mac version, and it's even possible to play on an Android phone, a modded Switch, or even a PS Vita. For all the 15 people who bought a PS Vita, I guess. But my point is, you can play AM2R on pretty much anything, and relatively easily too. It's basically Doom. I won't get into details here, but you can get the latest update and launcher for AM2R. Yes, this game still gets updates, as well as help to any questions you might have on the official subreddit, and on videos on YouTube. On the gameplay side, AM2R's world design is more easily digestible than most Metroidvanias, due to how progression is structured. Instead of the environment constantly opening up everywhere around you when you gain new items or power-ups, progression is mostly locked to one area of the map before you can continue to the next one. When backtracking, you basically never have to exit your current area to progress until you've killed all the Metroids and gotten all of the key items in that region. Additionally, while not as robust or detailed as Dread's, the map system and other tools given in AM2R are just descriptive enough that you can pretty much 100% the game without a guide. Even I, a huge Metroid fan, have ever only fully completed 2 Metroid games without external help, and those were AM2R and Dread. Finally, there's the elephant in the room. You might be wondering to yourself, why this specific version of Metroid 2? Why not play Nintendo's own official remake or whatever that is? Well, the reasons as to why Metroid 2 Return of Samus for the Game Boy probably isn't the best game to start out with are likely obvious and numerous enough that I don't have to go into detail about it. In short, a great game for its time, not so much now. But a comparison between AM2R and Samus Returns, on the other hand, is much closer in my opinion. Still no contest though. Like at all. Samus Returns was made by a Spanish game studio called Mercury Steam. As you might have guessed from the similar designs and art style, they're also the guys behind Dread. Now, I want to make this clear. I think these guys are very talented. Dread is one of my favorite Metroid games, and I can't wait to see what they'll do with Metroid 6, hopefully without crunching their employees this time, but Samus Returns isn't... it's not very good. I think even Nintendo knew it would be a necessary rough first step for Mercury's team to practice and move on to bigger projects, like Red, because they made them make the game for the 3DS, and released it in September 2017, 4 months after the Switch had already been launched. I'm sure it was partially because of how unsure they were at the time if the Switch would end up being a hit, but I feel like they still would have at least released it on both platforms if they believed more in the game's success. In any case, why do I think that Samus Returns is not great? And mind you, when I say that, I don't mean to say it's bad either. It's a very solid 7 out of 10. It's one of the best looking 3DS games, I guess, and revolutionized aiming and combat in 2D Metroid games, but it lacks some of its own character and merit. It changes very little of the original game's biggest flaws and doesn't do enough things to justify having remade it. At least in my opinion. Its environments are uninspired and unatmospheric. Most of the only good songs are just remixes of existing songs from other games, and almost every individual area looks exactly the same, aside from its color scheme. And all of this without even getting to the fact that it was only for the 3DS, so you can only play it on that handheld or an emulator. In essence, it just isn't the best possible version of this game to play, but AM2R is. So, what's the key takeaway here? Well, aside from the fact that I probably shouldn't have filmed this during the sunset, look at my green screen, this is going to be hell in the editing room. Well, Second, a good rule of thumb in life is that you should probably play a Metroid game at least once in your life, regardless of which one it is. Just not that one. But if you care for my so-called expert opinion, another Metroid 2 remake is the way to go. I've left a link in the description below to some resources so that you can get started on that front. But more generally, Metroidvania is an amazing and expansive genre. Indie games in this space have seen an incredible rise in popularity in recent years, perhaps exemplified by the fact that you very possibly knew about Hollow Knight before ever learning about Metroid, and you probably really enjoyed my previous joke there. But there's tons of other games I can recommend to you in the genre. SteamWorld Dig, especially the second game, is an excellent Metroidvania with a focus on vertical platforming, resource gathering and mining. It was one of the first games I got for my Switch, and it still holds up very well. An absolute favorite of mine are both Action Verge games, as they blend old-school Metroidvania world design and aesthetics with some incredibly interesting new items to collect, and deeply philosophical lore to discover. If you're more about frenetic player movement and visually striking environments, the Ori games are also amazing. I have only had the chance to play a demo for one of them, but my friend assures me they're great. Isn't that right, Amos?
Okay, yeah.
Exactly. Editor Franco here again. To add to this list, I've played a few more Metroidvanias since originally recording this video, and would like to add both Pseudo Regalia and Animal Well to my recommendations. They're both great for different reasons. Feel free to check my Metroidvania list out down in the description for more information. In recent years, I've heard a lot of people complain about how there's nothing to play anymore. Everything feels samey and boring, they say. But these are usually the kinds of players that just get stuck at playing annually releasing shooters and the occasional story-heavy third-person action-adventure game. And well, those can be very fun as well. A gaming palette like that is obviously very limiting. Recent Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight, Metroid Dread, Animal Well have arguably been some of the best games of their respective years, and they all feel very unique and different from each other, united only by somewhat similar structures and extremely well-designed gameplay, of course. I don't think there's ever nothing to play. You just haven't really started looking yet. Good night, everyone, everywhere. And on videos on YouTube. YouTube. Yeah. With those pseudo-intellectual semantics out of the way, I can advise you on three different orders of playing through the game. A chronological order, a with those pseudo-intellectual semantics out of the way. With those